wow, $80 a week, how can I commit to that? That is so huge. But I took this leap of faith and I just loved it. On the 1st of July 2003, I was diagnosed with breast cancer.
Wow.
That was quite a big upheaval in my life. And I took this big risk, like I would employ people where I didn't have the clients for them, but you knew the clients would come. And we were sort of at our peak. We had like 90 staff. I think we had 19 offices.
Wow.
Yeah.
Welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast, where we talk with business owners, marketers and professionals to extract what makes people and businesses successful.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Not the Rob Bell Podcast. Today's guest, I've got Jane Beale. She started her company, All Areas Speech Pathology. She took herself from the dole queue, battled breast cancer, she was a single mum, and now she's got a $5 million a year business. We're going to find out all about it now. So, Jane, I understand that you've created a business essentially from nothing, from a small startup, and gone all the way through to 90 employees and almost $5 million a year in revenue. And that's obviously in your trained profession of speech pathology. That's a good word to stumble on. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started your journey with speech pathology before we get into the business side and a bit of your background?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to talk to you about speech pathology, Rob, because I'm still so passionate about it. I started my degree 30 years ago at Flinders University in South Australia, and that's when I was age 20. So at age 17, I'd still never heard of speech pathology as a career. And I grew up in an area where it wasn't affluent at all. So, speech pathologists probably weren't really around. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. But as I was in my last year of high school, so in year 12, I knew that I loved helping people and I wanted to go to university. There was an expectation in my family that I would go to university. So I'd set myself that's what I would do, but I didn't know what I wanted to actually do there. I'd thought about being a teacher, about being a doctor. I loved music. I was a piano teacher at that point. I loved languages. And I'm pointing out all of those things because I think they're the key ingredients for speech pathology. It's like 1 foot in an education sort of sector and 1 foot in a medical sector. It's like you want to teach and you want to heal, but you don't want to be just in one or the other, and speech pathology is an applied science. So when I was 17, I met a lady who was a speech pathologist and she was playing a guitar, and I said, what do you do for a job? And she goes, I have the best job. I play with people's children and I get paid for it, and I play my guitar and I play with toys. And I was like, well, what is this job? And she said, I'm a speech pathologist. And I even remembered the exact location where I was. It was in Perth, and it was when the America's Cup was on at the start of 1987. And from that day, I knew that's what I wanted to be.
Wow. I think one thing, as you say, the interesting thing about speech pathology, I never understood entirely what a speech pathologist did. When I thought of speech pathology, before I knew really more what it was about, I would think of sitting in a room and, saying, you say apple, not apple. Or, and it was a very sort of a clinical sort of process. And it wasn't until my son went to a speech pathologist, not for speech, but for his eating, that I sort of started to understand exactly how broad this field is.
Yes.
And so there's some misconceptions there, or something that, you think someone comes to you and often thinks that it's one way, but in fact it's a little bit more playful.
Yes, definitely. And it's a big part of our profession where we need to advocate and promote what it is that we do. And I think every speech pathologist that you met would have at least a handful of stories about someone saying to them, oh, I thought you just did lisps, or I thought you just did pronunciation. That's what's been exciting for me being a speech pathologist. First of all, learning to do it myself and then educating others. And it is the fact that it's such a broad field. And basically a good way to think of it is speech occurs in the face. So everyone understands that. Obviously, it's your mouth that speaks. And speech occurs or sort of first starts in the brain. So anything that's to do with the brain and to do with the face and to do with the mouth is going to be covered by a speech pathologist. That's why we have sort of one foot in that medical side of things, because when we study speech pathology, we actually do a lot on anatomy and physiology, and we have to fully understand the brain. We need to know about children's brains as they're born and as they develop, and we need to understand about adult brains if there's an accident or a trauma or a stroke. And so we cover like the whole lifespan. So that's one really, fantastic side of it. And then from an education point of view, we're looking at how people learn. And so speech is something that is just generally learnt by children as they grow, and a speech pathologist becomes involved when something goes wrong. So pathology, for those people listening that aren't sure, it means sort of error or impairment or something wrong. And speech pathology, therefore, is something went wrong with speech. Now, you mentioned also about swallowing, and speech pathologists do work with swallowing because when we look at the mouth and the brain, then also the sort of oral structures, so the head and the neck, all of the structures that we use for speech are the same ones that we use for swallowing. And for that reason, speech pathologists sort of have become like the clinical experts in that field as well. And that's a big surprise to most people, including myself. When I started my university degree, I didn't know I was going to be watching people eat and swallow. Some people make their whole career as a speech pathologist in the swallowing side and probably wish their title could actually include swallowing in it. There isn't anywhere in the world where swallowing is included in the title. However, in many places in the world, language is included in the title. So we use speech as a sort of a layperson's term. When you speak, it could be what you say, and it could be how you say it, and it could be what you remember and what you're thinking, and that's the brain coming in. But actually, there's another word that speech pathologists use, and that's language. I could throw back to you now, Rob. Like, if I say to you speech and language, do you think there's a difference?
Probably not. It's...
They're interchangeable terms for most people?
For sure. Yeah.
Mm.
I guess it is an interesting point that you're making. And when we were first referred to a speech pathologist in my son's case, I was a little bit dubious as to what we were actually going there for, because his language was actually remarkably good for his age. But he had, some lack of interest in eating and that sort of thing, and his tongue muscles need improvement, or whatever the case was. He's much older, and it's sort of a distant memory now. But it was sort of an eye-opening experience for us in terms of we'd heard speech pathologists being advertised and that sort of thing. We just fully underappreciated exactly the gamut of work that you're undertaking. Speaking of that gamut of work, I understand that you guys are very involved in Auslan and the education of that as well. Is that from teaching Auslan from birth, or is it from after you say like brain injuries and that sort of thing, like a re-education? Can you explain a little bit about your...
Yeah, sure. So people that are listening and have heard you say the word Auslan, some people will know that Auslan stands for Australian Sign Language. Some people might not be familiar with that term. And it's important to clarify a couple of things about sign language and the role that speech pathologists play. And this is to show respect to the Australian deaf community in particular, and to make sure that we're promulgating the right information. So people that know a little bit about me know that I've used keyword signing, which I'll tell you what that is. I've used keyword signing since I was 15, and so it's been a big part of my life and a big part of my role as a speech pathologist. But just briefly, there's two sides to looking at communicating with signs. There's sign language, where we use that word language to say that actually it's different from speech or different from spoken language. So Auslan is the Australian deaf community's language. Australian Sign Language, and it's actually not the same as English, and people don't realise that it has different grammar. So I would say to you in English, what's your name? But in Auslan, I'd say, your name, what? So just like in Italian or French, like in French, you might say an object, the book, and then the colour. So the book red, whereas we'd say the red book. So Auslan also is different from spoken English. So what speech pathologists get involved with, and myself in particular, is individual signs, and we do take them from Auslan so that if I'm going to use the sign for drink, and I'm just showing you that now, I'm using...
I know that one.
You know that one? Good, yeah. I'm using the same sign that someone from the deaf community or someone who's fluent in Auslan, could be an interpreter or a teacher, they would use that sign. So it's kind of like we're picking up on the signs that are going to be recognised by other people rather than just inventing a sign. What we do with keyword signing is we use the vocabulary, so those individual signs, but we're actually using it to support speech. So as a speech pathologist, a big part of what we do is a thing called ACC, alternative and augmentative communication. So some people need an alternative communication because they can't speak. Some people can speak, but they need an augmentative communication, which means they need something to support their speech because perhaps it's unclear, like someone who's had a brain injury or a child that's born with coordination difficulties. So speech pathologists are involved with sign language in a version or a type called keyword signing, and we deliberately take the language out. And that's a deliberate thing to show respect to the deaf communities in Australia and around the world, that we're actually not using their unique language. We're using English. We're using our spoken language. And what the signs do is they add visual information. So I'm sure that you and people listening would use visual information to support your speech all the time without possibly even thinking about it. So a good example would be like if I do that now, I'm tapping on my watch, I'm giving you an idea that's something about time. So like I might say to you, how am I going for time? And can you see that's the visual communication, but it's also supporting what I say. Yeah, and we use it for like bye and how are you and even clapping. So keyword signing is actually about using individual signs to support spoken language. That's why speech pathologists have this, lovely relationship with sign language and with communicating with hands. Some people, like myself, go that little bit further and do learn Auslan. I'm not fluent in Auslan. I couldn't stand up and interpret like you see people doing, but I can have a general conversation. I'm a bit like someone that, did say maybe Italian at school and did a little bit of study, and then when they go to Italy, they can sort of get by.
They can order a beer.
Yeah, order a beer. But I couldn't stand up and do like a university level lecture. Yeah.
Okay. Or one of the Premier's addresses that keep broadcasting.
Yeah.
One query that I had, I did do a little bit of digging around your background.
Yeah.
And one skill that I understand you have is some basic understanding of Moroccan Arabic.
Oh, wow. You have done a bit of digging.
A little. But one reason why I found this interesting was the abstraction of communication from, say, English grammar formats and that sort of thing. Do you think that, did you deliberately undertake that in order to learn different behaviours of language, or was it just something, it was just a course that you happened to take?
Oh, well, you've opened up a lovely topic now. So if you remember me telling you when I was 17, I met this lady who was a speech pathologist, and I had just finished high school and I didn't know what I wanted to do at university, and I was a bit frustrated because I wanted to go to university and there was that expectation. So I thought I'll do languages at university. So I was 17 turning 18. Now, funnily enough, the way to do languages back then, this is in 1987, was I had to enrol in a mathematical science degree.
Interesting.
That was the only way I could do languages. It was just what was offered at the university in Adelaide. So I did do well in maths in year 12 and I did like it, but I didn't want to be a mathematician. But I enrolled in mathematical science so that I could study Japanese. Now, when I met this lady who was a speech pathologist, I thought, now I know what I want to do. Well, I won't do my mathematical science degree. I'll defer, because I was going to have to try and now apply for speech pathology, and I hadn't sort of been on that pathway. And right at that time, my father, Philip Beale, he got a job working in Morocco, which is a bit random, isn't it?
It is a bit strange, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm the youngest of 3 children. My brother and sister both sort of were in their 20s and were on their path for life. And my dad was going to go and work, first of all, in Syria and then in Morocco. And he asked if that was okay, if he went. And I said, well, I'll come too. And he was really delighted. And so later that year, like 1987, my father and I was now 18. My father and I both travelled. We lived in Syria for a while, and then we went to Paris for a month to learn to speak French. And then we ended up in Morocco. And being 18, knowing I wanted to be a speech pathologist, I'd always wanted to learn languages. I just went, this is amazing. Here I was speaking English in a country where almost nobody spoke English. I'd learnt French and I was learning it really quickly. And then I had the opportunity to learn Moroccan Arabic by being in Morocco. I pushed myself a little bit and I learnt to read and write in French, and I learnt to read and write in Moroccan Arabic, which is actually, anyone listening that knows a little bit about it, it's one of those languages where Moroccan Arabic itself isn't really known as a written language, because it's one of the Arabic languages and everyone reads and writes like in classical Arabic, but they don't speak classical Arabic. So when I learnt Moroccan Arabic, there were very few ways to learn it written, but I was determined to do it. And if you see me doing that with my hand, it's because you write from right to left.
Yep.
So I'm remembering. And what was so fascinating, and the link to speech pathology, is I spent about 2 years away. I didn't get fluent in Moroccan Arabic, but I could hold my own and I could entertain Moroccan people. I could sit there and they wouldn't expect me to speak Arabic. And I even learnt a bit of Berber. And when I went to do my university degree and we had to learn phonetics and linguistics, I was so much further ahead than my classmates, because I'd just spent 2 years immersing myself in how can languages be different, how can grammar be different, how can speech sounds be different, how can encoding sounds with written like graphemes and the symbols be different. And when you learn at university, you learn, first of all, what we all do and what's normal. And then you learn like what's a pathology or where it's gone wrong. And so as I was learning just what's the normal for spoken Australian English, I just had this great advantage because my mind was so analytical. Yeah, so it's really fortunate how that happened, isn't it?
And I think that was partly my interest, was whether it was a deliberate sort of professional skill building exercise or whether it was just happenstance. And and so it feels like, sometimes our business ventures and where we end up in life, you look back retrospectively and you see these things where you couldn't have seen that pathway.
No.
However, it really serves us well as we train or as we develop professionally. And so it stood out as an interesting thing. And because I've dabbled in a few languages like French and other Roman languages, and I understand how similar they are, and there's a few nuances and things, but when you move to something like Arabic or like South Korean, which I started learning when I was a teenager, it really shakes or mixes your perception of grammatical formatting and things like that, and I've never delved into any Arabic languages, and even though the interest is there, it sort of falls its way down on the list. But I have always wondered just how interesting it would be to go to go into that sort of area. So let's sort of fast forward a little bit to when you started your practice. Do we call it a practice when it's a pathology?
Speech pathology practice,
And so obviously, like most in this field, you would have started as just working yourself directly with clients and that sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about that evolution of just where you first started and seeing those first patients, and how you came a few years later to broaden that?
Yeah, no, that's great. So In terms of practice, yes, we do call it a speech pathology practice, and we talk about private practice. And then the other sort of place where speech pathologists work is in like government organisations or maybe not-for-profit. So when I first started, which was back in 1993, it was for the South Australian Education Department. And so certainly back then, a new graduate speech pathologist, you do 4 years at university, a new graduate speech pathologist would never start a private practice. It's not like a conditional thing where some professions like psychology, there's actually, specific supervision years that you have to go through, or say being a doctor, you do your internship. So in speech pathology, it's not so much like that. It's more, it was just understood that when you graduate, you don't open a private practice.
Okay.
That's changed a little bit now. So now people do go into private practice a little bit quicker. But back then in 1993, I started off working for the government, and that's where I learnt my skills, and I had like a peer group and a manager. By 1996, I took on my first private practice patient, and I did that like in addition to working for the government, which was allowed. And that was partly because back then the funding for speech pathology was a lot less than it is now, in terms of governments recognising the need for people to have speech pathology, and then also coming up with the funding to support that. If you think about Medicare, like if you had to go and see, say, an ear, nose and throat specialist and fund it yourself, or if you had to go and have plastic surgery and fund it yourself, or a hip operation and fund it yourself, we're talking a lot of money, aren't we?
Sure, yeah.
Can't do that. Now, speech pathology isn't covered by Medicare, and it's only covered by some private health insurance companies. So, excuse me. So it's important to have the government funding. Now, back when I graduated sort of in 1993 and I worked for the government, people got their speech pathology free through the education department. But my very first private client was a little girl who was at school, and back then there wasn't funding for school age, which is quite fascinating, isn't it? So she had a genuine difficulty. She had difficulty pronouncing the TH sound, the R sound, and she had a lisp. She was 7. She was being teased at school. Sounds a bit like a typical sort of speech pathology.
Probably more what we expect.
What you expect,
encounter.
yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, she couldn't get any funding, and she couldn't be seen at a community health centre because they prioritised children before they went to school. So she was my first private client, and for half a year I just had one client, and that was all. So I worked for the government and I had this one private practice, and I remember it gave me the opportunity to see the difference. And the difference was that I now at the end of the session had to say, here's an invoice, or how would you like to pay for that? And that's quite different. And some speech pathologists will work their whole career and never be in private practice. They'll only work for government or not-for-profit agencies and all the money side of things. They don't
Behind
have anything.
The scenes.
Yeah,
yep.
yeah.
The admin at the front.
Yeah, that's it. But I'm sort of glad that I graduated in an era when it was mostly government positions and you didn't have to worry about the business side. So that then when I did first start in private practice, I just had one client for 6 months, and it seems crazy, but that was a big deal. I had to think about, do I have the right insurance? Is this parent satisfied with the level of service I'm providing, because she's paying out of her pocket? And I think back then it was maybe $45 for the session, which seemed like a lot of money for her and a lot of money for me. But I also felt this great satisfaction. I didn't have to follow any rules. I didn't have to say, I can only see you 5 times and then now I move on to someone else, or I'm sorry, there's a waiting list. Like I could just see her. So for me, it was the birth of, I like private practice. I like being my own boss. I know what this child needs, and I like being able to provide that.
So you really saw the ability to customise the care that you were giving.
Yeah.
And so it came with this burden of all this extra work,
yeah,
as anything like that does, but it gave you that flexibility and freedom to really sort of follow the passion. But I suppose the public side of things really gave you time to hone your skills and find your feet as a professional And because then you weren't during that period you weren't distracted by the admin and
exactly
and the business
yes.
side.
Yeah. So you were asking me what the journey was. So I thought I'd just tell you that I started from very small beginnings. From there, the following year, I had the opportunity to reduce my government hours from a full-time job to a 0.7 or so like 7 days out of a fortnight instead of 10. And I had a house then, and I converted a back room into a speech pathology clinic. And people listening who work from home, maybe see clients, we call them clients, but could be clients or patients in your own home. That opens up a whole new way of thinking too, because I'd find myself, I'd wake up on Saturday morning, that's when I'd one of my clinics, people would come to the house, and I wouldn't be thinking, what resources will I use? I'd be thinking, have I cleaned the toilet? And if they come and see me and they want to use the toilet, what's the path they'll take through the house to get to my toilet, and will everything look tidy? So I worked from home for about 18 months and I loved it, and I got busier and busier, but I couldn't get past the fact that I really didn't like having people come into my house, because it just made me worry all the time. And I had pet dogs, and it was like, what if the dogs bark? And so after that, the next thing I did was I thought, I'm going to get a little office. So this is still back in the 90s. And my first office was funny because I was walking down the main street of Strathalbyn. So I lived in a country location in South Australia, and I had looked up a place that had a room for lease, and it seemed to me like this astronomical amount of money. And as I was standing looking at it, a lady said, are you looking at that place to lease? And I said, yes. And she goes, well, I've got a room to lease for $80 a week. And I think I'd been looking at like $200 a week. And I said, what, just one room? And she said, yes, in my practice. And she had massage and various things.
Sure.
And so I went in, and I remember that real thrill of this would be my spot. And wow, $80 a week, how can I commit to that? That is so huge. But I took this leap of faith, and I just loved it. I used to turn up. I was still working part-time for the government, so I looked forward to my private practice day, and I'd turn up and people would come and they'd be in the waiting room, and for some reason it seemed so much more exciting than something I was doing all the time through the government, but it was like personalised and
on your own steam. And
yeah,
and because I can really relate to that to that home visit thing. Winding back the clock, say about 15 years on Limeworks, we'd have clients visit my house where we had converted the back room and ultimately the garage at the front, so they didn't have to come through the house until the day where someone asked to use the bathroom. Yeah. And then we had to sort of like quickly close the doors on the bedrooms that were full of, junk and all that sort of thing. So I do understand that thrill of moving to the first office, and our first office was certainly nothing special, and we used to call it the fishbowl because there was no natural light. Yeah. And just windows, but they went to an arcade. Yeah. And so it is an achievement, and it feels so daunting at the time, and you look back retrospectively, and in hindsight it almost seems trivial. Yes. But at the time it is a huge step, and you worry just how you're going to pull it off. But it takes those leaps of faith. So you've got your office and you're seeing your patients. How did that transition then to... was that at full time at that stage, or were you still? No, still part time. Yeah. So in 1999, I had my baby Felicity, and I don't say my first baby because I've only got one child, so it was my one and only baby. So I had her, and I still had the office, and then I transitioned to just working only private practice for a few months before I went back to government work, and that's when I really understood the beauty of it because it was so flexible. So I would take Felicity with me in her little capsule, and I'd give her a feed and I'd put her down on the floor and I'd say to the client, right, she'll sleep for half an hour, we'll be fine. And I'd do my speech therapy. I just sort of had that flexibility. But then it was time to go back to my government work, and I did continue to work for the government for on and off for the next 4 years. And at that point it was when I was going, I can really see the differences. Like I had some government job experiences where the bureaucracy was really frustrating, or the team players that you're with were frustrating in that
I knew what I needed to do to help these children or these adults, but something would block me, either a rule or another person's opinion who was a manager or something. And so I could feel myself going, I'm going to get to the point where I want to do private practice because I think it's better for me, it's better for lifestyle. But most of all, the clients are going to get what they need. And that was what I was driven by.
I think the approach that you've got, it's very service first. And you know, everything we read in you know, everything we get educated around business is that, you know, it's service first and money second.
Yes.
But of course, business takes money and takes, you know, the books to be balanced and all that sort of thing. So it's not always quite that clear cut.
No.
How did you, so this was still in South Australia, how did you come to New South Wales and how did that transition take place?
So in 2003, I had one of those sort of from left field experiences, which is probably a bit surprising, but I was 34 and on my actual birthday I went to the doctor because I had some symptoms and there was breast cancer in my family, and I saw my doctor and said, I've got this symptom, you know, perhaps I need to be checked, and I had to go off to a clinic and they were all saying, you know, it'll be fine, you're young. But on the 1st of July 2003 I was diagnosed with breast cancer.
Wow.
Yeah, and that led to me having a mastectomy, and most of my family had moved over to New South Wales, to the Central Coast at that point. And so I made a decision to move over here to be near family. And so that was, you know, quite a big upheaval in my life. Very fortunate that I recovered. And once I came to New South Wales, I guess I had a whole new speech pathology system to learn because the states do things differently. And I did 1 year of working for Area Health, and then I went, now I'm ready, I'm going to take the plunge. So by 2005, I actually resigned from all government work, and I had 2 years where I tried working solely in private practice. I did employ people but not speech pathologists. Like I was teaching keyword signing quite a bit, and I was doing speech pathology, and I started a keyword signing choir, which was a really lovely thing to do. And I employed my first bookkeeper. I had a couple of people that helped me teach keyword signing at schools. So it was still very small scale. And I just basically worked so hard for 2 years, but I wasn't making any money at all, which is what can happen.
Well, I mean, it would have been almost a total start over as well. There's none of that. The South Australian history would have backstopped you or anything. You know, moving a state, different rules, different regulations, different just behaviours.
Yes.
And not having any previous client pool or anything.
No, that's right. Yeah.
It's effectively starting again.
It was starting again. Yeah, and that's probably the point where I had two little sort of tricks up my sleeve, I suppose. One was that South Australia has a big focus on speech pathologists in schools, and New South Wales doesn't. So I brought with me a lot of skills. I got to a manager level in education in South Australia, so I brought a lot of management knowledge and a lot of practical skills on how to work with teachers. And that was identified by New South Wales teachers and principals very quickly. So I started to get a good reputation in the school system and quite a bit of work. The other sort of trick I had was the keyword signing. So I'd been doing it from age 15, where I did work experience at a school and I met some deaf people, and I was a bit self-taught in how to communicate with sign. Plus I'd bought a dictionary and I'd done some courses. And then when my daughter was born, I taught her how to sign. And so I'd used it as a speech pathologist. So I had my foot in a lot of camps basically when it came to sign language and keyword signing. And on the Central Coast in 2005, when I said, that's it, I'm going to go fully private practice now, I put a little advert in the Central Coast Express Advocate, learn keyword signing for babies, children and adults. And I had 55 phone calls in 3 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
The power of the newspaper.
Yeah, back then it was
Back
newspaper. Yeah, and it's funny because I was in my dressing gown and I had all these phone calls and I even had the radio call. And one person said, "So are you calling from your office now?" And I wanted to say, "No, I'm in my kitchen in my dressing gown," but I tried to make it sort of sound, like this legitimate business. Which,
Sure.
Yeah.
And we've all been there.
Yeah,
I used to live near the bush, and so my office backed onto the bush, and you could hear bellbirds if the windows were open. So in summer, it was very confusing for people talking to me on the phone.
Yeah.
Especially who had no idea where I was based.
Yes.
Really. Hearing bellbirds in the thing. So I can relate to the slippers instead of dress shoes. And that's I think it all evolves from there.
Yeah.
So when you're taking these phone calls and things are obviously starting to rev up.
Yeah.
Did it sort of just rapidly, magically take off from there, or?
Well, not really. I would say that first experience of not working for the government. So after my breast cancer, I moved into state. I found myself as a single parent with my one child who started school, and I was getting a parenting payment, but my daughter was reaching that magic age of 7, which there were fairly new rules back in then. And the government said once your child turns 7, your youngest child is 7, you're not eligible for parenting payment anymore. And that was a new rule that sort of came in. Instead, you have to essentially go back on the dole and be looking for work. And so I enrolled in a thing called the NEIS scheme, which I'm pretty sure it's New Enterprise Initiative Scheme. I think that's what
New Enterprise Incentive
Scheme. There we go.
I did do my homework a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I knew one of those letters wasn't right, so thank you for that. And if you were in receipt of a parenting payment, because I was just in the last stages of it, I could do a Certificate 4 in Small Business Management. So I thought I would do that, and that enabled me to get my parenting payment for sort of another 6 months.
Okay.
And I needed that because I worked out I was working about 80 hours a week trying to get my business going. So that was a combination of seeing private speech pathology clients, developing keyword signing resources like photographs and booklets, teaching keyword signing classes, and then running a free sort of voluntary community choir all around learning to sign. And I had a lot of people with disabilities that approached me, and I love to include everybody in that choir. So I was pretty busy, and I was a single parent, and the parenting payment was just enough to live off. And then if I made money, which I felt like I was making money, people that start small businesses will know that. You sort of see this money coming in, you're going, yeah, I'm making money. But then when you go and do your profit and loss, you go, I'm not making any money.
It's quite a remarkable thing. The first year that I made $1 million, I actually lost 400,000.
Yeah.
So it's something you hear these people, made $10 million this year, or I made $2,000 yesterday.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's great, but is there anything left over?
Yeah, that's what's your profit and loss.
Especially when the energy and effort is going into developing these resources, doing community aspect things. It's by the time this is still pre-GST by the skin of its teeth.
Yep.
Taxman takes his cut and all that sort of thing. It's amazing how rapidly that money comes in and goes back out again.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and I was sort of having that pointed out to me because I'd do my tax return and with my tax agent, and I'd be going, "Wow, look at all this money I'd make," and then she'd go, "Oh yes, and your profit is
negative something."
Yeah, and I'd be like, "Oh,
yeah."
So I ended up with this difficulty, and that was in 2007, where I finished the New Enterprise Initiative Scheme. I was now having to supply fortnightly amounts to Centrelink, and I had got called in and I had a case sort of conference, and they said, you're not making enough money from your business to show that supports you. You now need to essentially go on the dole. And I was like, well, that's a bit silly because I'm even employing people. I'm a speech pathologist. Can you give me 12 more months? I know within 12 months I'll have this up and running. and they said no. And so I was literally queuing up every 2 weeks at Centrelink pretending to apply for jobs. No one's listening to this now. Of course, I was legitimately applying for jobs.
I'm sure the horizon's passed.
Yeah. And then I'd have to go in and have my little interview because you'd have to stand in the queue. And I did learn a lot there. I learned, to be very humble and to be very grateful because I was standing in this queue with a university degree and great career prospects. And it made me feel terrible. And I thought, there's people in this queue that haven't had the privilege I've had, don't have the qualifications I have. This is their life for the foreseeable future. And so I tried to learn from that experience, but I'd get to the front of the queue and speak with the Centrelink person, and they'd end up sort of saying, why are you here?
Yeah, because of the system.
Yeah. And so eventually a job came up with the government, and I was in the process of trying to buy a house for my daughter and myself and trying to prove an income. And I just kind of went, I didn't say I give up, but it felt a little bit like, okay, I have to go back and work for the government so that I can have security, so that I can stop being in a dole queue. It was disappointing, and I found it hard to adjust to, now having to follow rules again. But it was a necessary thing for me to do, and that was in 2007.
And you can, you adjust to the new, the employed state of play, I suppose. But you get the benefits of the paycheck, so it serves its purpose.
It served its purpose,
and so you may have to put your current plans on pause a little bit.
Yeah,
but, so how did you get back, come out on the other side of that?
Yeah, so that was a half-time job. So I worked half-time for the government, and I kept seeing private practice. I'd had an office, and I had to give that up, and I went back to working from home. I didn't think I would do it again, but I did. And I used to see people at my kitchen table, and I had 2 Labradors then, and my Labradors would be in crates, and I'd involve them in like the therapy. And I made the best of it, and I did enjoy it very much, but I worked so hard because I was trying to get my private practice to a point where I could give up the government work. So I was doing the half-time government work. I was still a single parent trying to see private clients. And in 2010, I did hit a real low point because I was just exhausted and I couldn't see a way forward, and all I wanted to do was give up my government work and be able to have more time as a parent, more flexibility, and just do my private practice. And I looked at all sorts of ways to do it, and I just sort of couldn't see a way forward. So I was sort of in that process when I'd been on my own for 7 years, and then I broke my ankle playing netball. I went to see the physio, and I married the physio.
I was going to say, and the rest is history. Wow.
Yeah, I married the physio. Steve, and he was doing what I wanted to do, and that was he had his own business and had worked really hard. He'd worked for the government, and then he'd started his own private practices, and he'd opened like 9 offices. He employed, I think at that stage, about 8 physios, and he said to me, leave your government job, take a risk, and do your private practice. It's what you've always wanted. And so that was at the end of 2010. I went, yeah, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And I didn't want to leave my government job at that point because I was worried about all my clients. And I even, I cried a lot and I felt really conflicted. But I did sit down with my boss, Beth, who's a lovely lady, and I said, I've got this real dilemma. I want to keep working for the government and all these children and they need me, but I've got this opportunity. And she was kind of like, well, as your boss, I don't want you to go, but as your friend, like, this is it. This is the chance for your dream. So in 2011, I registered the business name All Areas Speech Pathology. And my husband, Steve, his business was called All Hours Physiotherapy. And I came up with the name All Areas because I was like, it went together, all hours, all areas. And it sort of described the work ethic, I guess, because
you were working all hours.
Yeah, Steve was working all hours and I was working all areas. Like I was, it was a big effort back then. But it's what's necessary to get a business going, I guess. Yeah.
I think that's the important part of this early part of the story as well, is you had the support from people in your network, even if they were your employer or your manager at the time, and you got that honest feedback, because she could have quite easily said, "Oh no, I think you need to stay and take care of these people."
Yeah.
And or your husband could have said, "I don't think this is a good idea. You should just stay at your job."
Yeah.
And the last 10 years of business history wouldn't have happened if you didn't get that nudge and that honest feedback.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so, and I do remember those people, remember Beth, and the support she gave me. And then also my husband, he really backed me, and probably the rest of the journey in terms of my business growing, my husband, Steve, played a key role because he just pushed and pushed and pushed. And I think we do need sometimes people that will believe in us and push us, because, otherwise we go so far, but then
can't see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Or maybe it's human nature to find it hard to take risks. And I would say that I do take risks, and people that know me would say I'm courageous, and that's been a big part. But I'm also a very sensible person and a very cautious person, and there's a lot of risks that you have to take in business that you can't rationalise. You can't say, I've worked it all out and this is fine. You really just feel like you're constantly stepping off the edge of a cliff and going, okay, I'm going to start flapping.
Yep. Hoping the parachute opens before you hit the ground.
Yeah, that's right. And so there were times where I pushed myself or I jumped, and there were times when I was hesitating, and Steve would just give me a push over the edge.
That's good.
Yeah.
So if we think about, say, 2011, where you've opened up the first All Areas practice, can you give us some sense of the timeline? Because what's the total number of offices or practices that you?
Yes. So in terms of the growth of All Areas Speech Pathology, so it started in 2011, and for the first year it was just me, and I worked out of one office at Charmhaven. So Steve had a physiotherapy office at Charmhaven. Another office became available, and I said to him, why don't you move into that bigger one? And he said, no, but why don't you move into it? And I was like, no, I'm terrified. It was quite expensive rent now. We're talking, $1,500 a month.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. And he goes, no, you'll be right. Build it and they will come. And so I had this one office there, and then I used to operate out of a couple of his physiotherapy offices, but it was mainly Charmhaven. And after 1 year I was full and I couldn't see anymore, and I was working as much as I wanted to. So then I said to Steve, I'm going to start a waiting list. I don't like the idea of it, but I'm going to start a waiting list. And he said, no, employ another speech pathologist. And I didn't really feel ready to do that, but I had helped him a lot with his business, and he employed physios. And I did like the idea of being able to meet the need, because I didn't like when people rang and I had to say, I'm sorry, I'm full. So
send them to an unknown solution.
Yeah, That's right. So in March 2012, I conducted interviews, and I interviewed 3 candidates, and I employed my first speech pathologist, a lady called Ellen. She was a new graduate. And at that point I also had a PA working for me, Danica, and she was a speech pathology assistant who I had previously worked with. So she was helping me with admin and seeing some clients as an assistant. So I just had a few employees, and it was my first taste of having a speech pathologist work for me, where I got to mentor her and almost duplicate myself. And I just loved it. It was fantastic. And what I noticed was that Ellen would watch me work with my clients, and she'd just soak it all in, and then she would work with her clients and I'd watch her, and I'd see parts of myself in her, and I'd also, her own contribution and her own style. So,
of course, yeah.
And I enjoyed seeing the differences, and I didn't try to make her like me. I actually just tried to help her to be the best speech pathologist she could be. But I certainly found it, from job point of view, very satisfying. I was getting great feedback from clients, and I was getting this sense of I'm helping more people. So if I sort of explain what happened from 2012 through till now, I never once said I'm going to go and work in that area or I'm going to open that office, I would just get wider calls. So the next place that I got calls from was Cessnock. And Cessnock, I think people there didn't have a private practice speech pathology clinic. The government services had long waiting lists, and that's unfortunately just, what happens. The demand is great. And so I was getting calls from people, would you come to Cessnock? And I said, no, I'm sorry, that's too far. And then I remember a lady ringing and saying, I really need a speech pathologist. Will you please come? And I said, I'm really sorry, I can't drive to Cessnock for one person. And she said, if I get you 2 more people by lunchtime, can you come? And I said, what, you mean 3? And she said, yeah, I'll have 3 clients for you weekly. Can you come? So I said, okay. Yep. And then she rang back by lunchtime and she had 3. So
can I just ask, so when you're basically being inundated with leads and trying to, and you're trying to figure out how best to handle this.
Yeah.
Is this coming purely from a referral basis, or are you doing some marketing that's sort of...
I wasn't doing any marketing. I did get some business cards, and I think I had a website, but very basic. I don't think I had a Facebook page at that point, because even though Facebook was around, I think business Facebook wasn't...
It's not quite what it is
wasn't
now.
Quite, yeah.
Yep.
So I actually wasn't doing anything, and in fact... I used to joke and say to people, I'm doing de-promotion because remember how, because remember I had the waiting list and I wasn't sure what to do, and then I employed a speech pathologist, and it wasn't long before she was full, and I was kind of like, well, I couldn't possibly just employ another one. Like, this is getting ridiculous. Like, I had that balance of risk taking and caution, and I didn't have any history in my family of business people to to see as, this is how you do it. I was just sort of working it out. So I wasn't trying to promote, but the word of mouth was really spreading. The keyword signing was a big part of it. So I was getting a good reputation amongst disability organisations. I was teaching groups, and then I had quite a few clients who were deaf or hard of hearing, who I was teaching them literacy skills, and they were passing on information. And as I said to you before, I was working in schools and getting a good reputation there. So it literally was word of mouth referrals.
I mean, if you're doing group teaching and that sort of thing, then that effectively is your marketing.
Yes.
And, so it's sort of an indirect, but you're not no more ads in the Express.
No, I know. I didn't have to do that again. So with the Cessnock, I was going there once a week, and I really enjoyed that, driving out there. And then my husband said, well, you're doing well in Cessnock, maybe I'll get a physio clinic in Cessnock, because he didn't have one out there. So we worked a little bit together like that, but we were sort of going in different directions as well, because physio was adult-based and I was more in the paediatric area, the children. And it was at the time that the government, if you remember I said earlier on that there wasn't a lot of government funding, particularly for school age. So this is the era now that the FAXIA money came in, which was government programs to help children with disabilities and autism. And then by 2014-15 was the early sort of trials of the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Sure. So there were now people who were getting money or getting opportunities for speech therapy, and they were out looking for services, and the private sector was just starting to grow. And I think it was good that I'd had such a long background of government and private, because I had the confidence then to go, I will expand my private practice. But I did it just purely in response to people ringing. And then I had a couple of speech pathologists ring me, as they were finishing their degrees, saying, we hear that you employ new graduates. So I think that was a bit of a point of difference of my business, is that I was happy to employ new graduates. And most private practices, particularly when we're talking about 2012, 2013, most private practices did not employ new graduates. And in fact, the universities didn't encourage new graduates to go to private practice. And I would have agreed with that, because if you remember me saying when I first graduated, it was good to go into the government service.
System,
yeah. But what I did with my business is I tried to run it as though it had the structure of a government service that I myself had experienced, but had the flexibility of private practice. And any profit I was making, I was sort of pouring back into the business, and I was really trying to create this model where new graduates could come, be mentored by me directly. And so there was that sense of duplication, and my real key vision and my standards, I suppose, were that the employee is very well looked after. They're not asked to do anything that I wouldn't do. They're not asked to work too many hours. They're given time for research and reflection, are given mentoring and support. And then the clients themselves, are treated as well as possible. So they're not rushed and they're treated as people, not numbers. And that's how I like to do it. And so I tried to make sure my employees got to have those same relationships. And so it was a very relationship-based business where everyone respected each other, no gossip. It was just really supportive. And as I started to take on some administration people to make sure the speech pathologists had support, I was taking on working parents, and I was a working parent. And I think that was another key thing, is that I'd say to people, if your child's sick, don't come in. That's fine. If they've got an assembly that's important, go off and do that for an hour. And so I started to get this culture of real loyalty and everyone looking after each other. And then the need kept growing and the referrals came in. So it just kind of grew. I didn't try to make it grow. It just grew.
I think the interesting thing here is that, you've basically developed this model of operating and sorry, my chair's squeaking. So you've developed this model of operating and you've sort of built this foundation of a scalable business, even though you're very directly involved in mentoring new talent and that sort of thing. That sort of scalable model is sort of evolving while you're working on it. But importantly, you're investing not only the profits back into the business to grow it, but the time and energy hasn't sort of diminished as the business grows in those stages.
Yes.
And then something like NDIS comes along and you're primed effectively to capitalise on that.
Yeah.
And so how rapidly did it scale once NDIS became an important aspect of your business? Yeah.
So what happened was in terms of getting more offices, we did eventually get an office in Cessnock, and then one of my staff members lived in East Maitland and was travelling to Cessnock, and then I had people living in Newcastle and travelling to the Central Coast. And I wanted to look after those staff, and I knew they would burn out, and we knew that NDIS was on the horizon. And I thought, I'm going to end up with people wanting NDIS services and speech pathology services like in East Maitland, and I've got someone that lives there, but she's driving out to Cessnock. So then I said, well, I'm going to get an office in East Maitland. So I actually got offices for either where the clients were or where the staff lived. And I used that as a real strategy of happy staff are going to stay. And if you can have only a short commute to work, that's going to help when the rest of your job is quite stressful, because speech pathology, you're giving out, you're helping people in a time of need. There's a legal responsibility to have all your notes correct. So it is stressful. So the things that I could control the stress is what I tried, and that was flexibility with hours, offices close to home, the option to do some paperwork at home if need be. And so I had now developed a reputation, I guess, even with the university and with people that were looking for where they might work, of this is a very supportive private practice to work, particularly as a new graduate. And so as the NDIS came and we were able to confidently advertise more jobs. And I think at the peak, which was probably the end of 2017, I had like 14 new staff start in at the beginning.
Wow.
And everyone was busy so quickly. And I took this big risk, like I would employ people where I didn't have the clients for them. And for a few weeks or even occasionally a few months, you were losing money, but you were allowing those staff to just start gradually and learn their skills and be mentored. But you knew the clients would come, and they did, and they came. And so by the end of 2017, start of 2018, we were sort of at our peak. We had like 90 staff. I think we had 19 officers.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a big team of admin, 15 people in admin, and I had introduced layers of sort of managers. So I had speech pathologists who'd started as new grads and worked their way up. They were the managers. I didn't bring in sort of external people. I wanted it to be that people managed in a way that they knew what the new graduates or other staff were experiencing because they'd grown through it themselves.
Retain that culture that you've got.
Yeah. It did mean a change in the culture in that I now wasn't directly mentoring everybody. And I mention that because I sort of say that was the peak. And today, 2020, I'm not at 90 staff anymore. I'm at 60. And I'm not at 19 locations. I'm at 13. And I've actually done that deliberately because from about 2017, 18, I had my end of year get together, and for the first time I was going, the sort of the intimacy and the relationship that meant so much to me and that ability to see myself duplicated in staff, I could just feel that it wasn't there to the same level. It was still there in the staff I had close contact with, and then I could see they were duplicating themselves sort of further down. But I definitely felt I got to a point of I need to make a decision. This business is scalable and I can keep going, and I could get to 200 staff, 500 staff. I could go Australia-wide. But me personally, is that what I want to do? And I was sort of in the process of thinking about that and going, what's my next deliberate step, when we had the next sort of phase that came in, probably due to NDIS. I think even Speech Pathology Australia, our peak body, they've sort of acknowledged this too. NDIS has been a real game changer for everybody.
Yep.
And we've seen changes and growth that none of us probably could have expected.
So can I just touch on when you sort of came to this realisation that perhaps the business was evolving into, it sort of takes on a life of its own, and you don't have control over things you used to have control over.
Yeah.
And one thing in business is that growth isn't always the goal, as much as a lot of the time it is.
Yeah.
And certainly in big business, that's key metrics, and if things go backwards, that's a bad thing and all that sort of thing. But I think especially when it's wholly owned and you have control and you can make decisions for your own benefit, not just for say shareholders or something like that, you have the ability to scale things back when it's not taking on what you saw it doing, or even just cap the growth at a certain point. Maybe you have a really successful cafe, but you don't want a chain of 50 cafes or 1,000 cafes. You just want the cafe. And so I guess, is that where you've sort of landed now, is, you could keep growing, but you would prefer to have a slightly smaller company? And
yeah, well, it's sort of, my answer to that is sort of yes and no. And a little bit like I didn't end up with a big business through deliberately going, I want a big business. I ended up with that because I didn't want to ever have a waiting list. And in that whole time, I never once had a waiting list. In fact, people would ring and they could usually get in that week or the following week. And that meant the whole culture of my business was positivity and meeting people's needs, and that was good for the administration staff and it was good for the speech pathologists. So the change that came about at sort of end of 2017, beginning of 2018 was there's not enough service providers anymore, not enough people coming out of university to meet the need. And so I, honestly was on a scale of, even though I'm not having the same relationships that I had, and therefore the intimacy and that sense of contact isn't as satisfying, I was willing to evolve to a new place where, well, I need to get used to, this is what it feels like to have a big business. there are things going on that I don't know about, but I can now have a month away from the business and it just runs. So I was in the process of balancing that when this shortage of staff started to hit everybody. So what we found was at the start of the year, the growth, it just keeps coming and coming. It still hasn't slowed down. Yeah. We could have employed another 12 speech pathologists, but now when we put the adverts out, you didn't get 30 applications, you got 2 applications.
Yeah.
And so the beginning of 2018, suddenly we couldn't get staff. And with the NDIS, it's created a big private sector practice. It's created a big private practice sector. It's created more non-government organisation sector. So it's created more non-government organisations and it's created not-for-profits and everything's changed. And now people that came to me as new graduates because I would offer work now had a few years up under their belt and had the opportunity to apply for other jobs. And there was so much diversity and so much going on. So, many of my staff who were happy and felt supported and liked what they were doing, they were like, oh, well, I could try something else. And, and that's okay too. I was like a starting point for them. So we just saw across the sector more change. And it was at that point where I went, okay, am I going to really drive this hard, maybe use recruitment agencies? I'm going to get more staff no matter what because growth is what's important. And that's when I went, maybe growth isn't what's important to me. And now the sector's changing. So what I did was I didn't deliberately try to stop because I used to go around saying to people, how do you slow a business down? And nobody really...
It's probably not too many self-help books or business books on how do you slow growth.
No, yeah. That's right. And it was really fascinating. And then I'd have, family and friends and employees and people with different opinions and they'd be like, go for it, more. Yeah. And then there'd be people like, oh, well, if you don't want it, just stop. But there wasn't really anything that was quite just what I needed. So, again, it was quite lonely. It was hard being a leader and in that sense, and I thought it started with me. I have to make the decision. And it came at a point of time where, we were getting new staff on and then there would be changes in, people look for other jobs and there'd be movement. And I saw this constant, because as I said before, you put a lot of money in to get an employee established or an office established. I felt like I kept putting money in, getting things established and it would stop. Sure. And then I just went, that's it, enough.
So you saw the growth go up, but maybe the profit came down.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so then I just decided I'd go with like a natural attrition. And so when people moved on, I didn't replace them. And we did start to close offices where we might have had 6 people working and it was going really well, and then we were down to 1 or 2. And so then I'd say, well, we'll close that office and people can move to a nearby one. And so the culture changed a little bit because for a while it was just, everything anyone wanted, I felt like I was able to do it. And then now I had to really stop and think and make some quite hard at times business decisions, but because I had the big picture and, how do we keep things going? And at the same time was the lack of people applying for jobs. And the NDIS itself, it went from a state-run situation to federal. So now there's like a commission. So there were rule changes and audits. And, yeah, I just got this really clear picture of 90 staff, 19 officers. It's too much.
So can I... because NDIS has been a big part of, at least been a big reason for the growth. When you're involved in sort of a government scheme like that, do you think that provides unique challenges as to just being in a sort of a public market? We see these things like NDIS happen with, say, solar or insulation and that sort of thing, and industries can pop up overnight and then vanish. The day after that scheme ends. Do you think there's sort of a risk with NDIS or something like that doesn't exist in a regular market, or you think it's just another factor in business and because every industry has its risks?
Yeah, I think the need was always there. And so what the NDIS did was it uncovered this huge need of people with disabilities. And I think the government would have tried to project, how much need is out there and how many service providers are going to be required and how many families would be applying or individuals would be applying. And I'm sure they were, quite overwhelmed by just how many people qualified. From a speech pathology point of view, we know over the past 10, 20, 30 years, there's been an increase in people with autism. And some people say that's because we're better at diagnosing, but it's been shown that even with an increased awareness and an increase of ability to diagnose, there are more people, per 100 or per 1,000 with autism. So there's that side of things. And also from speech pathology, we know that the change in society, children are spoken to less overall before they go to school, and it could be because of bigger houses, so families are not all in the same room. It's to do with, both parents working, both grandparents working, so less one-on-one, introduction of devices, smartphones. There's all these factors. So we know that there are more children having difficulty learning to talk, and that's just the speech pathology industry. If you look at, say, occupational therapy and physiotherapy, people are moving less. People are more obese. Then you could look at psychology and mental health. So if we look at all the different areas that the NDIS covers and all the people in the population that have a legitimate reason to need services, there's been this massive growth. So I think if the NDIS stopped for some reason because the government chose to stop it, the difference would be that it's not just like a trend or just something at the moment that's, everyone's talking about, like it's genuine need. And then I haven't even mentioned all the people that, you might traditionally think of or historically think of as disabled. So people, in wheelchairs and people that with intellectual disability that are needing supported homes or needing transport support. There's this massive group of people out there. I think Australia is really proud of the fact that it's got the NDIS and that it's looking after people with disabilities. And I think that comes with the times that we're living in. If you look at the Anti-Discrimination Act, when that was enacted and supporting people with disabilities, it's the last couple of decades we're moving towards a better life for people and higher expectations for people. So speech pathology's very much in that part of society. 1 in 7 people are said to have a communication disability. It's a lot, isn't it?
So and I suppose for those reasons, the NDIS is enabling the service as opposed to creating a market where it didn't exist already. It just broadens the reach.
That's right. And that's what's been a dilemma for me as a business person is, when I say I didn't go out trying to promote my business or market, it's because the need was there. So instead I would say I respond to need. And therefore the hard thing for me now, and I'm living it day to day now with my business, is when I have made a choice to respond to these changes and to say I'm going to reduce my size, the need hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
And for the first time in 30 years as a speech pathologist, my business now has a waiting list, and my administration team now receive phone calls from very distressed people who can't be seen. And in most cases, there's respect from the administration officer, there's respect from the person ringing up, and it's just a sad phone call or a frustrated phone call. And we try to be as understanding as we can. But as you can imagine, sometimes they're not pleasant phone calls. Sometimes there's a lot of frustration. My team, who I really want to look after, their mental health suffers if they have unpleasant phone calls or just the disappointment and the frustration that they can't say, yeah, we can see your child next week or we can see you next week. So something that I've tried to avoid for 30 years, I'm now in this dilemma of, by putting myself first and saying I don't have what it takes financially or mentally or emotionally to keep growing against all the setbacks, I'm now going to take care of myself. I've turned 50. I'm going to think about me as a business person and as an individual. it doesn't come easily. I don't sleep easily at night because the need's still there and it's growing. And with the NDIS, lots of businesses are feeling what I'm feeling. They can't get staff. They've got waiting lists. They're closing their books. It's even got to the point where speech pathologists who've always been held in such high regard by the community, sometimes we're spoken about negatively because we're seen as, the service providers that do this and do that but are not helping us, or, they're in their business. It's all about money. And, that breaks our hearts because it's the complete opposite. We didn't get in it for the money. We got in it for the hard work and meeting the need. And, yeah, it's a hard time to be in business as a speech pathologist at the moment, mostly because of the NDIS, because what that's done is it's exposed the need. It's given people a taste of having services. So many families are so well helped, and we're seeing incredible stories of people's lives being changed, and it's fantastic, and we just want to do more and more of it, but there's limits, and one of the limits now is not enough service providers.
And in terms of like looking at your business journey in this area, you've gone from hoping to get more clients to not being able to service all the clients. How do you handle that personally? Like, what's the biggest thing that you struggle with in terms of dealing with, the turning away these people that do have a genuine need, but we all have to draw a line somewhere?
Yeah, well, I've always been someone who tries to find a solution. So one of the ways I'm dealing with it is looking at alternative solutions, and we know there's a shortage of speech pathologists, but the NDIS does allow people to be seen by speech pathology assistants. So I've started a program where I'm training people to be speech pathology assistants, and then offering some people sort of like an adjunct service. So they might see the speech pathologist once a month and the assistant 3 times a month, and that allows you to see more people. So by doing that process, that's given me some comfort because I don't feel like I've just shut the door, it's just black and white, and I've gone, stop, no more. Instead, I've gone, well, what strategies can I use? And I get some comfort from that. But I guess I also, I probably reflect a little bit on my age. So I'm 50. I've worked as a speech pathologist, like university and work. It's now 30 years. I do feel that it's okay to put myself first a little bit and to say, well, if I want to slow down a little bit now and look at my quality of life, then that's okay. And 10 years ago, I couldn't have done that, but I have tried to sort of focus on self-care. And, I've modelled self-care to my employees for so long, I need to have it for myself too.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think from a mental health point of view, the biggest emotion that I've struggled with through all of this is fear. And no one told me that by being a leader and being that responsible would be so scary. And you don't know until you do it. And then once you're in it and you're so scared, you can't do anything. You just got to keep going. And, there's lots of things in life like that where, like, if you're being chased by a lion and you go, I'm really scared, you don't stop and go, oh, just reflect how scared I am. You just keep running. Yep. So with a business, when you've got 19 locations and 90 staff, every single week you need huge amounts of money just to break even, just to pay wages, just to pay rents. And if you think too much about those figures and, how much you pay the tax office and everything, it is overwhelming. I don't like to use that word lightly because it can get used a bit overused these days,
Sure.
But it is overwhelming and you feel this such sense of responsibility. But, Australia needs leaders. It needs people, business leaders and political leaders and community leaders that are willing to live with that fear sitting on their shoulder, because there's got to be some people that provide that structure, and you can't just step into it like with a weak build up. Like, you couldn't go from not doing it to just doing it and cope, I don't think. That's why I'm glad I had that, that very first private practice client and that very first office for $80 a week. It kind of gave me the chance to develop that resilience and that mindset so that now I can sit here and go, yeah, sure, I'll pay 60 people week after week after week and be responsible. That's okay. But I am looking forward to managing that in my business because I don't want to always feel so burdened. Yeah. And when everything's going well and, you know, you've got profit rather than loss and you've got happy staff, and then it's easier to live with that fear. But then when things go wrong and, you know, things like the bushfires and, you know, you've got COVID-19 and all those sorts of things, it's just an added layer, and then you're very aware then you've got this burden on your shoulder. So, yeah, I take my hat off to all business people, whether they've got one client or 1,000. And, you know, people listening to this, I'd like them to think about that mental health side and building slowly and realising that you need to develop resilience. But Australia thanks you if you take that on board because you are doing a good service for people.
Yeah, I think it's while there's, you know, there's certain expectations of business owners to make good choices and all the rest. At the end of the day, we're all just people doing what we think, you know, making the decisions we think are best at the time. You know, as you've experienced and as I've experienced, business does grow beyond where you can sort of bail it out yourself. You know, at $80 a week for rent, you know, if it all goes pear-shaped, well, you know, you'll figure out, you know, the worst you're on the hook for is a couple of $1,000. You know, when you're looking down the barrel of, you know, 7-8 figure payrolls and that sort of thing, there's no personal contingency there.
No.
It's, you know, you have to make the business, you know, stand on its own feet, because if it falls back on you, you're going to collapse as well. So, you know, and that's just a nature of business growth. So we've actually been talking for about an hour and 20 at the moment.
Oh my goodness!
So
I didn't realise that.
No, it's been an interesting discovery. So I might just fire a few like real quick questions at you. So in terms of looking at your business now and looking back, what's something that you've learnt now with the business that you have that you almost conflicts with something that you thought when you first started?
Something that conflicts.
Or maybe it just confirms. Maybe you knew it all along.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you should say that, because as I grew my business, I tried to stay very true to my principles and not conflict. And the biggest one for me was that I would treat people well and have this good relationship, and that people would see me as a boss, you know, someone they respected and that they looked up to. And once the business got to a big enough size, I realised I was too removed from some of the people working for me. So 90 people, I realised I didn't have that. And now that we're back at 60 people, and even just recently I've been doing quite a lot of using like online platforms and really trying to connect to people, I realised that I'm back to a place where it's more me. So I think I had a period of conflict, which was you can grow a business and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and as long as you've put the foundations there, you'll always be that boss who's like that friend and that intimate contact and someone that you're influenced by. And then I've realised that actually no, they'd get to a point where you lose that direct influence and you rely more on other people. And for some people that's great, and maybe that's what they want. So some people might have loved it where they end up with just a small circle in their business who they relate to, and otherwise everything's going on. But I realised that for me, I want to know my staff. I want to celebrate their wins and be sensitive to things that are going on for them where they need support. And actually a big business that, you know, might be just known so well throughout Australia and have this great reputation and be fantastic, that wasn't going to be worth it to me if actually I couldn't bump into my staff and know them and feel I had a relationship. So, yeah, I probably reached my point of conflict, and now I'm bringing it back to where I sit comfortably.
Okay. Obviously, culture's played a pretty big part in your business as well. How important or how do you feel around not just making sure that the right people are in your business, but that the wrong people are not in your business. And do you have anything you can put in there?
Yeah, and that played a big role in me, that thought too, because as my business got bigger, recruitment stopped being something that I did and went on to other people. And it doesn't mean that recruitment hasn't been done well, but it just means that it hasn't been done by me, and there is a difference. So when I first started, I was very intimately involved in all the recruitment and made all the decisions, and did it in a way that meets legislation, but it's also quite informal and personable. And then I got to a stage where it was so big that I was having to delegate to other people, but they're not the business owner. And so it had to much more follow legislation, and therefore the sorts of checks that I used to go, you're aligned with me, not a person's bad or good, but aligned with my principles. It was hard to ensure that's happening when I wasn't involved in it. So in terms of getting the right people in, I've found that the key is that I do meet these people and I do get to know them, because there are differences in business, and some businesses, they are driven by ambition, could be driven by money or profits, driven by people that do want to scale, and that's sort of their key focus. Well, for me, all of those things were part of business, but that wasn't my key focus. For me, my key focus was that someone had a need, and that either myself or someone in my team could meet that need, and therefore someone's quality of life improved. And so I was really looking for people that were inspired by that, by improving the quality of life of other people, whether that's the quality of life of my staff or the quality of life of the people that they see, their clients. So, there's definitely been people who have come along and gone, I want to work for All Areas Speech Pathology because I've learnt about it. It represents what's important to me. And then there'd be other people who would come along and be like, I want to be a speech pathologist and I can do it here. But they could have done it somewhere else as well, if you know what I mean. So, so that's been an interesting journey for me of learning who's the right fit for my business. And I imagine that would be the case with other businesses too. It doesn't just have to be speech pathology. If your staff are aligned with your general sort of ethical approach and your views on the world, it's definitely easier. Mm.
Yeah. So did you ever find yourself in the situation where you had someone in your business, even in a primary role, and discovered that, despite the stringent interviewing process and the onboarding, that it just didn't play out as you expected?
Yeah, surprisingly, there was never any kind of disaster, and I think partly that's because speech pathologists in general are good communicators and good at interpersonal skills, and we did always have referee checks and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't say there was ever anyone that was like, oh my goodness, this person's wreaking havoc. Or is it wreaking havoc or wrecking havoc?
Don't know. We'll go with wreaking.
Wreaking, yeah. This person's wreaking havoc on my business. So I wouldn't say that ever happened. And in fact, in terms of gossip in the workplace and business relations and harmony, we've just had an amazing run. It's been fantastic, and the culture's been great. But there've been people that have come in and, possibly wanted to work more independently than others, or work more closely with people than others. And speech pathology is a business where you've got to have really strong independent skills and be able to just forge your own path. And then you need really good team skills for times when, you're getting advice from other people or collaborating. So you need people that actually are really good at both. And at times we've had people in where they would have been better if they could have just been fully independent, or if they could have been much more immersed in a team. And so, they've probably gone and found employment somewhere else where they're not so spread out, because we'll have offices where you might be the only person there on that day, or you might be amongst other people. So that's probably been the one thing, is occasionally not a match exactly on the independent versus team approach. And speech pathology is a hard job, and, you know, there are times when no one else can do it for you. You know, you're legally responsible, you're ethically responsible, and you just have to manage your own professionalism and reach out for help if need be, but you're sort of responsible for asking for what you need. So, yeah, some people, you know, expect a little bit more everything being provided for them, and some people are very good at finding their own path and speaking up if they need help.
Sure. Okay. So it sounds like you've made a few changes to get things back on, you know, aligned with yourself and where you see the business being comfortable. Are there any particular plans you've got over the next, say, 5 years? You know, is anything drastically going to change, or are you really just honing the craft and continuing on?
Yeah, I'm probably at a stage now where I'm comfortable with the number of staff and the number of offices, and it seems like a more manageable number, but I'm very aware that we have waiting lists, and that's uncomfortable and that's disappointing. So I don't really want to grow any bigger. I don't have any plans to deliberately get smaller. I'm probably going to take the approach that I've used up until now, which is let's see what it naturally does. But for myself, you know, I have goals in life that aren't just around seeing clients myself or just doing speech pathology. I've just bought a property where I'm living on 1.5 acres.
Lovely.
In the country, yeah. So I want to develop my life outside of being a speech pathologist, which I feel that I'm ready to do. And my dogs are a big part of my life, and I've always wanted to breed puppies. So I'm just going to make sure that the business stays true to my principles, but it gives me breathing space away from it. And, you know, that might be that it can tick itself over and carry on as it is now, but we'll also have to be responsive to outside influences such as NDIS and community need and the number of graduates coming out of the universities. So there's some things that I can't control, and my plan is to just be responsive and be ready.
Do you think if the business starts, you know, really humming along as you start to remove yourself from the day-to-day so much, do you think maybe you'd look at more on the, you know, broadcast of, you know, training ideas and that sort of thing, where you can have a really great impact but still limit the actual time involved, you know? And I know you have some online videos and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You know, do you see more of that playing a role so you can still have an impact?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I'm in the process of writing a book about being a speech pathologist, and I love the idea of
is that an exclusive?
It could be, yes, that's it. I love the idea of being on a sort of circuit where I, you know, motivational speaking and talking with people. Definitely the training. I love doing that, and that can be done in a seasonal sort of way, and so can help me to meet some of my other life goals. And I've got some fantastic staff who are very clever and who are developing key things. Like one of my staff members, Shaylee Hilton, is learning all about eye gaze technology, and she's a very bright lady, did extremely well at university and now works as a speech pathologist and, you know, helping people that are sort of locked in, being able to communicate. And I can see that what would be satisfying for me is helping individuals to develop these sort of niche fields and giving them backing so that, you know, the equipment might be expensive to purchase, but where other people have helped me, you know, if I continue to take risks to be like a launching platform for other people. And some of the people that have worked for me have sort of said, I'm ready now to start my own private practice. So I've had some wonderful clinicians who've now used All Areas as a launching pad, and I've worked with them, and they now run their own private practices. And I see that as a great way that what I've put into the community gets to continue even without my input.
Amazing.
And yeah, that's really satisfying as well.
Well, I think it's certainly about the impact that you're trying to have, and you know, have maximum impact for you know, that measured input, while you can still do the things that you want to enjoy.
Yeah, that's
it. And I think that's an amazing thing. So I really appreciate you coming and chatting to us today, and it's been an amazing discussion to learn about you and All Areas Speech Pathology. If someone wants to know about All Areas Speech Pathology, where do they go to find you?
Well, Facebook seems to be the platform that people use these days. So we do have an active Facebook page, and that's has posts most days. We also do have a website, so All Areas Speech Pathology. We sometimes use the shorter name AA Speech, just because it's less typing.
Yep, sure.
So you could look at our website too for some information. And we're based on the Central Coast, but we do have offices that sort of spread around the Hunter and Lake Macquarie regions. So we go as far as like Raymond Terrace, East Maitland and Cessnock and Toronto, and then on the Central Coast. So I guess people might have a local office that at the moment they can't call into, but that they can certainly phone us or send us messages online. So there's always someone that's happy to have a chat with them.
Fantastic. All right, Jane Beale from All Areas Speech Pathology, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There you have it. I hope you really enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please like it, share it, or leave us a review on your favourite platform. It helps us show more of this content to people just like you.